the United States finally passed the Lend-Lease Act, under which America sold Britain 50 World War I destroyers, as well as armaments and food, in return for cash and land rights to be settled up after the war. Some thought that this help was too little, too late. But with supply convoys being sunk at an alarming rate, Britain needed all the help she could get. In April 1941, Allied shipping losses were up 50% on the previous month. Wolf packs of German U-boats lurked in the Atlantic and attacked Allied convoys bringing supplies to Britain. Just as air forces had ace pilots, so the German Kriegsmarine had ace U-boat commanders. Erich Topp was to become one of the most decorated U-boat captains of the war. But initially, he was dubious about the cramped and smelly interior of the German submarine.
The
first time I boarded a U-boat, I said to myself, you won't be able to cope. The lack of space and the smell, the diesel and everything was completely different from anything in my experience so far on surface ships.
Once submerged, the only real threat to submarines was depth charges. These were 200 to 300 pound charges of high explosive, which detonated at a preset depth, dropped from destroyers and corvettes. George Heugel was a radio operator on board U-110. His job was to listen for the sound of ships and depth charges.
We attacked this convoy and torpedoed 2 ships. I noticed there were some pulses coming through. They were pinging or somehow striking against the boat. So I said, they're fixing on us. And then, of course, the corvette arrived dropping depth charges. When there were depth charges, I would be the first to hear them when they hit the water. And then I would know that they were on their way, and in 2 seconds, perhaps 2.5 seconds, they would explode. Well, you'd get goose pimples.
U-boats hunted Allied shipping convoys in wolf packs. They would spread out and search in a line across a wide front. When one submarine spotted their prey, it would shadow the convoy, reporting the location and speed back to base. Messages then went from base to the other U-boats, and when night fell, they would converge on the convoy and attack simultaneously. The wolf packs would usually hunt over a 2-week period, being refueled at sea by a supply ship. The Allied convoys had escort ships to protect them from the U-boats, so while the submarines were hunting the convoys, they were themselves hunted by the destroyer and corvette escorts. George Heugel was operating the hydrophones on the U-110 in the Norwegian Sea, listening for enemy ships.
I was on the listening device in the morning, perhaps around 10 or 11 o'clock, and I heard a kind of splashing noise. And before I could listen to it again, there was this huge explosion. It was so big that our people, our comrades who were sleeping at the time and lying on their bunks, they all jumped up. Everyone was wondering what had happened, and so of course was our captain, who was facing me. He shouted at me, "Are you asleep or what?" But I said, "No." He said, "There has to have been a depth charge." So I said, "No, they weren't depth charges. If they were depth charges, I would have heard a ship sailing over us to drop them." It was a bad situation. I said, "You can listen in. You would be able to hear a ship leaving. One ought to be able to hear that as well." But there wasn't anything. That night, when we met up with our supply ship, we talked to their crew. They told us that they had had a torpedo plane attack that morning. And when we looked at our charts and checked, at the same time that we had heard the noise, we had been near them, so it was their attack which we heard.
Eric Topp was in command of U-57, and he too had to cope with the threat of planes. U-57 had been taking on supplies in the German-occupied French port of Lorient.
Und ich bin dann zu meiner dritten Fahrt bin ich von Lorient.
Then I left Lorient on my third voyage.
Und wurde quer ab von Irland.
And off the coast of Ireland we were bombed by a plane which came unexpectedly out of the clouds and damaged us severely.
Und hat uns schwer beschädigt.
One of the diesel engines came off its base, so I only had one diesel left, which meant a much reduced speed.
Das heißt reduzierte Geschwindigkeit auch.
The young captain had to make a decision. Should he return to base for repairs or carry on searching for Allied convoys?
Und dann entschlossen wir uns, in die irische See hineinzufahren.
And then we decided to sail into the Irish Sea, almost to Liverpool, so as to be sure of being able to engage the enemy and also to compensate for our reduced speed. Then a convoy came out of the night. We attacked with success, and we were then pursued by a British destroyer and forced to submerge.
Mit Erfolg. Und dann wurden wir von einem britischen Zerstörer im